Welcome to another episode of Some Patches Required, a show where we hope to educate and entertain you on the ever-turbulent games industry. As always, I am one of your hosts, Zach.
And I am your other host, Aaron.
And before we get into the meat and potatoes, I just wanted to say a quick thank you to all of the returning fans, as well as any new fans that we might have watching this episode. We appreciate you. We care about you. Thanks for coming. And then additionally, we do want to say, please make sure to like and subscribe. Whatever the gratification button is, I don't know that I like that now that I said it, on whatever platform you are listening to us on, please show some support. We always appreciate it. Thank you. And then also, if you don't mind too terribly much, sharing the show with a friend or perhaps a mortal enemy, we also appreciate that. We're not too picky. If you think our voices are like nails on chalkboard and you wish to make someone else suffer, feel free to, shoot this over to someone you absolutely hate. And it's all the same to us.
Exactly. Hurt them by helping us. It's the kindest form of audio torture.
That is true. The kindest form of audio torture.
I'm imagining that on I was about to say on like our little like Captain America Brave New World, and they have to like sift through the wreckage of reviews for that movie to find the blurbs that's like filled with bombastic action and other like little positive nuggets in largely negative reviews. That's just some shade at the new Captain America movie that doesn't seem to be doing so hot. But ours is just like the kindest form of audio torture. Some Patches Required says, Some Patches Required is the kindest form of audio torture.
That is like unironically a absolutely sick tagline to have. Like, yeah, I'm a big fan. Before I somehow end up on a rabbit hole that I don't mean to be on, quick comment. This episode, we are going to be talking about the good old Bobby Kotick, the former CEO of Activision-Blizzard and lifelong
joggers wearer.
Joggers wearer? Is that what he was wearing? I don't know that's what
I have no idea. I seem to remember some pictures of him like jogging around LA or something like that.
That is very, very possible. For those that don't know, our favorite human being, on Some Patches Required at least, is actually not Jason Schreier. It is a man named Bobby Kotick, who, of course, as I said, kind of leaves an interesting trail of opinions at Activision-Blizzard. Actually, following me listening to the podcast that we're about to talk about today, a podcast talking about a podcast, I was at a game night with a bunch of ex-Blizzard people, Aaron, and I mentioned Bobby Kotick, and it was a funny response of everyone being like, "That man ruined Blizzard. That man." Like,
so I think it's safe to say that internally the culture is not pro Bobby.
At least not at Blizzard in Austin, Texas.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
That lines up. So to not to cut you off, but to perhaps lead you in a little bit more, for those of you who may not know, there was a recent, let me see how recent actually, it came out.
I think it was like a week ago.
Yeah, just about, published on February 10th. There was a podcast, put on, it's the Grit podcast, which of course sounds, much more intense than it is considering it comes from Kleiner Perkins, the venture capital firm. And they sat down with Bobby Kotick / Kotick. I've always said Kotick, but I think it's technically Kotick, and I don't really care one way or the other, so I'll probably flip back and forth. But they sat down to discuss his career, hear some of his stories, and at least for us, kind of provide a fascinating companion piece to a lot of the literature we've read about Bobby over the years. So we figured it was worth digging into that appearance a little bit, just because it's kind of a fascinating package all put together, all said and done.
I think that the interesting thing about Bobby Kotick is he's almost like this. Now there's a few people that are like this, I think, in the games industry, but one of them is certainly Bobby. He's a bit of like a mythical creature, not necessarily in the sense that he doesn't exist, because he is very clearly
he very much
living
exists.
entity, but more that I feel like his impact on games has been so wide-reaching, and he's just kind of seen as such a negative figure when it comes to being a CEO that it's like impossible to kind of escape his shadow. Also, kind of another interesting, important thing is that I'm pretty sure he was the highest paid CEO in video games for a while. Like, he had this ridiculous package tied to his, tied to Activision-Blizzard, like, doing well. Like, if they hit their metrics, he was making like millions of dollars in shares and all this other shit. And of course, he got a golden parachute when Microsoft ended up taking over, as many executives do. Just truly a legendary figure.
Yeah, and I will say that, like, his presence in the game space since, the Commodore days, it's hard to how do I phrase this? You can't take the man's influence from him. There's definitely a lot to be said about whether that influence has been positive or negative. Especially when it comes to the actual people making the games and the actual creative visions behind any of these games. But you can't deny the man's impact on the industry at large, basically since it started, right? I mean, because I think the prevailing understanding is that, like, the modern video game industry more or less started with the NES, right? Reproving the viability of home consoles and gaming becoming a mainstay in the American and global household, and he's been involved since those days.
Well, so it's kind of interesting. In the podcast, they actually talk about was it the NES that they talk about selling so well at Toys R Us that they had like an exclusive partnership with, that like overnight people believed in games, or something like that. Yeah. There's an interesting story in the in this podcast where they talk a little bit about that. So I guess kind of jumping into that specifically, the first thing I will say is I actually maybe don't listen to the full 2 hours. There are some kind of cringy moments. I don't really like the main kind of younger guy that runs this podcast more long term. He's kind of annoying. I'm sure we'll get into that. But I do think that there's some interesting moments about games history and kind of the executive view of things that you can gather from this conversation. So I would certainly recommend, giving this podcast some form of a listen. Just know going in that it seems like the Grid podcast's entire purpose is to glaze up billionaires as much as possible and make them look like they're the coolest, kindest, most reasonable people in the world. Like, there is very clearly an agenda for this podcast, and that is what it is.
Yeah. This is very much an environment designed to make Bobby and people like him comfortable.
Yeah.
This is less of an interview interested in uncovering like asking challenging questions, and much more of a PR maneuver. If anything, it almost feels like an after the fact refutation of the sort of picture painted of Bobby, both in the press at large and specifically in Jason Schreier's most recent book, Play Nice, which I would say is not unfair to Mr. Kotick, but it is not congratulatory or like super praising of him, as opposed to this podcast, which that's basically all that it is there to do, right? Is give this guy a chance to basically celebrate his influence over the games industry that culminated in his historic payout, which is, you know, a topic of multiple, a point of multiple congratulations from the other gentleman on the podcast, Bing Gordon. Who
to clarify, there are 3 gentlemen on the podcast. There is the host, who we don't care enough about to look up their name.
Also, we're going to say some not... Yeah, I was going to say we're also going to say some not super nice stuff about his whole thing, so we didn't want to call him out, or at least I didn't want to call him out by name.
Yeah, I think he's a normal dude, for all we know, so we're not going to fling people at him. Also, if you wanted to figure it out, you could look it up.
Yeah, it is in the credits on the video. But yeah, there's the host kid, and then there's Bing Gordon, and then there's Bobby. And Bobby is very much the subject. The Bing Gordon is a former CEO of a bunch of different stuff, and then also, what was I going to say? He's an advisor to Kleiner Perkins, the investment firm that puts on the show. Yeah. So it's pretty obvious that neither this kind of sycophantic kid or the longtime friend and CEO chum buddy of Bobby, they're not going to, hit him with anything challenging, as is evidenced by some of the claims he makes later on. They're not interested in challenging him at all. What he says is gospel.
Well, I think I was going to bring this up later, but I want to bring it up now because I don't want to forget. To your point, I mean, the not Bing Gordon, but the kid who actually hosts the podcast. And we keep calling him a kid just because he has this like kid overly eager energy that's just really cringy and hard to watch. Like, it's very clear that Bobby could have had this conversation with Bing, and Bobby literally says that he came to this interview for Bing Gordon and not for, the Grit podcast. And I think that's a joke, but there's a lot of truth in that joke. Anyway, regardless, this younger guy that's interviewing Bobby makes it very obvious that he doesn't give a shit about the truth, because on multiple occasions he'll bring up what the reported story is from various news outlets. And I want to clarify, these news outlets, for a lot of the stuff, don't propose theories. These are like facts about things that have happened. Like, there have been investigations that have found things that are deemed to be the truth. And yet this host, this younger guy, proposes all of this as though it is fake news that is being, provided on the internet, and that Bobby is being attacked. And he literally asked Bobby, he's like, obviously that's what the internet says, but like, what's your side of the story? What's actually true? He does that multiple times, and he doesn't try to combat anything that Bobby says.
No. There were a couple of really great moments where he's like, well, yeah, because obviously everything you read on the internet is true these days, so here's the story, and then proceeds to read off something that's, like, not clickbait garbage.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, I forgot where we're at with our relationship to, like, the truth, just as a nation. I'm sorry. I forgot that we're just kind of not doing empirical truth anymore. That was my bad.
Well, also, Aaron, what you're forgetting is that the truth only matters for the pores. When you're rich, it doesn't matter what's true, because you've got enough money that fuck everybody else.
Fair. But yeah, I think tonally the podcast was an interesting 2-hour odyssey for me. But again, like to Zach's point, though, it actually is worth listening to if you're interested in. You'll have to like put on your cynicism glasses just a little bit and take some of it with within the context it's being presented. But there is some really interesting stuff, and I'll be honest with you, there are a couple of really good stories that Bobby puts down in there that I think are legitimately entertaining, interesting, and if true, do speak to a very long and storied career in the industry, regardless of his sort of enduring legacy of
Well, I think you bring up a great point. I mean, obviously we talked about this a little bit before we pressed the record button, but I am of the opinion that I think that Bobby does a fantastic job of coming off as a cool, collected kind of guy that you could hang out with and probably have like a good time if you were doing a one-on-one kind of thing. And I think he comes off as like a moderately charming kind of guy. If you take everything at face value and you don't really know a lot of the background around him.
Yeah. It's an important caveat there, because my overall takeaway of his personality was, I don't know, maybe my own cynicism kind of slanted my opinion of it, but over the course of the 2 hours, there was no point at which I was not aware that I was listening to basically two very rich old white men just kind of talk about their money and their status and their privilege. And it did, if you do look at it from that angle, it does actually make some of what they say sound more sinister than anything. And you start to get kind of like what the warped understanding of what the word friend means to people in this particular level of social strata. So I didn't, again, I think without the context of like his career and his legacy and understanding like who these individuals are. Yeah. I mean, I think he can come off as charming and reasonably down to earth, but the minute you reintroduce that context to me, it all just felt very kind of gross at a lot of points.
Well, to your point, I think the other interesting takeaway, and maybe this kind of is just exuded by anyone that comes on to this Grid podcast, but I think it really illustrates how when you reach a certain amount of wealth, the doors really open up to you in a way that you just don't get if you don't have that kind of wealth. I'm going to elaborate on that. So there are multiple stories in this podcast, to your point, Aaron, that illustrate this point, but I think probably like one of the strongest ones is, throughout this whole podcast, Bing Gordon and Bobby are largely just kind of having a conversation with one another, and they're constantly talking about all these crazy rich people that they know, and then they like name drop the spouses of these people who are incredibly wealthy that they know, like they just had dinner with them on Tuesday, which is already wild. But there's one part where they're talking about Bobby at one point in time wanted to make a Jurassic Park video game. And I can't remember the full context of it because it wasn't important enough that I paid like a ton of attention to it. But Steven Spielberg, he was friends with, or he knew well enough to like get into contact with and have all these like conversations with him. And ultimately at this time, Bobby was at Activision as the CEO. They didn't end up winning that business to develop that game, but you just really get this idea of like how closely connected these people are and how easy it is for them to just hit up somebody like Steven Spielberg, and have this opportunity that no one else could possibly have. So that elitism, that aristocracy, that really does come through in a lot of ways, I think, throughout this podcast.
Right. There are a lot of moments where Bobby is just like offhandedly like, well, I wasn't 100% sure about where I should go with the deal, so I just called up my good friend Satya. And it's like, oh, like the CEO of Microsoft. You just like, oh, it's a Tuesday, 6 p.m. I'm drinking a nice oolong tea. Just call up my good friend, the CEO of Microsoft. Okay, cool. So you needed some advice, so I called up my good friend Steve Mnuchin. And it's like, okay, yeah, I guess that's a normal thing
I call
to just
both of
do.
them frequently.
Yeah,
Like,
we haven't had D&D night in a while, the three of us, but
yeah, I know you've been itching for that for a while. Yeah, it is very interesting too, because one of the first stories that they asked Bobby about was, and I don't actually know, so I haven't finished Play Nice yet, Aaron. So this could come up in Play Nice. But I think it would have at this point if it was going to. But they talk about the whole CEO of Vivendi Games. So there was a CEO of Vivendi Games, there was a CEO of Vivendi, and then there was Bobby Kotick, who was Activision, and there was this merger where Activision was taking all of Vivendi Games. And they start with this anecdote about how Bobby Kotick was going to be a co-CEO with this guy called Bruce Hack, who was the CEO of Vivendi Games, not of Vivendi, the parent company. And basically where it goes is like, there's this discussion of the ownership at Vivendi, the parent company, didn't want there to be co-CEOs of Bruce and Bobby. They wanted Bobby to be the CEO, and they were going to cut Bruce. And it was like this weird, like, corporate politique situation where Bobby was like, well, that's not very cool of you unless you tell Bruce. And then, like, the parent company was like, well, we're not going to tell Bruce that we're letting him go. So then Bobby has a conversation with him. And the only reason I bring this up is it's the first story that's mentioned. It's this gross kind of like political, executive situation where Bobby tries to paint himself as this like charismatic guy that really didn't want to screw over this guy, Bruce Hack. And that could be true. Like, this could be a true story. But what I think is interesting is that it's mentioned immediately by him, and it immediately paints him as somebody that cares about other people's feelings and other people's well-being. And that is not the narrative that you typically see when Bobby Kotick comes up in conversations. Now,
right.
Granted, most of the time when Bobby Kotick is screwing people over, it's not other executively
exactly
normal people. But it's an interesting kind of framing device I found, Aaron, where I feel like from the jump, he's trying to paint a positive picture for himself, you know?
Yeah. I was definitely going to say the key thing to remember there is that Bruce Hack might have been useful to him at some point in the future for whatever reason. And Bobby is a shrewd enough businessman to know when to and not to burn bridges, professionally speaking. So, I mean, obviously he would have a much more, personal interest in trying to maintain, his ethical code in regards to the treatment of another CEO. So, yeah, I don't think he's probably going to extend that same level of care to the people who are getting laid off or the people whose, projects get cut because their ultimate product won't serve the bottom line as well as World of Warcraft or, whatever it is. Dismissing allegations of, harassment and workplace toxicity and stuff like that. Like, okay, yeah, all of those things are levied at disposable pieces of his money-making machine, right? When a gear starts making noise, you replace it with a gear that fits the same slot and does not make noise. You don't mourn the gear. That's what you do when you're fixing a machine. And to Bobby, the companies he's running are these machines, and the people in them are the cogs, and the ones who are disposable, and the ones who aren't sit atop the pile. And, that's maybe just me being extremely cynical, and I realize that's, potentially libelous, but it doesn't strike me as a huge stretch considering the track record that we see. he would play by a different set of rules. But of course it would be self-congratulatory within the context of that anecdote. He has to establish himself as that has to be the way it goes.
Well, I think, and one, I think that this interview is such a good companion piece to Play Nice. Like, and like I said, I haven't finished Play Nice, but I've gotten past the part where Bobby is introduced. And in the book, Jason Schreier, to your point, it's really interesting. And we'll probably have an episode where we talk more about the book in general, but it's interesting because, to your point, he doesn't paint Bobby as like a horrific.
He's not the villain.
Demon of a man. And he really paints Bobby. I think he literally says that Bobby is generous and caring about those that, perform for him. And I don't think that he would say, I don't think he said malicious, but he, those that failed him, he's quick to kind of do away with. Right. And so, kind of watching this interview of him, which I guess we should have said, we've never actually listened to Bobby talk before. Anything that we have seen that's Bobby talking was always, like
reactionary to some degree,
some kind of quote. Yeah.
In terms of the context.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So actually sitting down for 2 fucking hours and watching him talk, it's interesting because I definitely got that energy. I don't think that Bobby Kotick is some demon. I think he is a human, but and I'm sure there are people, even people that maybe don't, benefit him financially per se, that he cares a lot about. I think he comes off as a person that if he cares about you, the easiest way to maybe get him to do that, depending on your relationship to him, is to make him a ton of money. But I think he cares a lot about people that are close to him. I think the problem is, like, when you're a CEO, you're not going to be close to everybody in your organization. And he ultimately makes it very clear that his passion is running a business optimally, which means he's going to be disconnected from a lot of people and view them as inefficiencies, which means he's not going to give a shit if he starts cutting people. He thinks of things in terms of like money. He can appreciate the artistry of people that care about games and want to make art and all of that until it starts to tick away at him making money and him being efficient. Like, I don't know. It's an interesting thing where I think it's really easy to demonize the guy. I certainly don't think he's a good person. I think he's done a lot of bad things, but he's not literally Satan.
It does often, and I say often because this is not a blanket for everybody, but it does often help to like put a face and a voice to a character. And Robert Kotick has been a larger than life character in the games industry for a really long time. And so hearing this stuff directly from him was definitely an interesting perspective shift. Not again that his attempts at charm necessarily won me over, because I do still think that one's actions do speak a lot more to like how they'll be remembered than one's bottom line, or the way that one presents oneself on a podcast that I still have some very strong opinions about. There's one thing I need to bring up in a minute, but yeah, I don't know. Like the cracks in the narrative do start to appear when there's like conflicting bits of story. Because again, like he'll present himself like he's having a conversation with, I think it was the Microsoft CEO again, saying like, oh, you probably shouldn't buy us because, you don't have that like undying creative energy. You're a business person. And I'm like, well, that's also you. And he tells this anecdote about being in pitch meetings for Toy Story 2 when they were working with Pixar, and Steve Jobs was there looking over new builds of the game, I believe. And Steve Jobs was frustrated that the new CEO brought in some stuff about like market research and focus groups. And he's like, do you think Gone with the Wind came from a focus group? Do you think that great art comes from focus groups? And he kicked the CEO out. And I'm like, well, Bobby, you can't really align yourself with the Steve Jobs of this conversation at this point in your career, but that is exactly what you're doing in the conversation. You have not proven yourself to be a steward of a Gone with the Wind style creative approach. You're a product guy. There's a reason that CEO that got kicked out was a guy you brought onto the team, and he came from Procter and Gamble.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'll make this quick so you can get to that point that you wanted to just mention, and then we can get into some of the more specific things. I mean, I think we could rant about like the macro level of this discussion for a long time. But what I will say on the image note too is I think Bobby really tries to convey this image that he's this like hyper technical guy. Because for those that don't know, Bobby, at the ripe age of 19, did start a software company with his roommate from college. Now, he was more the business development end, get funding, build business relationships, all that kind of stuff. His roommate was the more technical individual. And what's interesting is I think Bobby really tries to paint himself as also being hyper technical by knowing a lot about like chips, and really what it is he knows a lot of very high level knowledge that probably does to a degree go fairly deep just because he's been in that space and he has access to information that a lot of us that aren't in any of those spaces don't have. So I'm sure he knows a lot, but he is not a technical guy. And so it's interesting watching him try to paint himself as more of a kind of like developer type when that's not what he is.
Yeah, he's been adjacent to it for long enough for it to like rub off on him in certain ways, but he's not that. He's much more of a spreadsheets person than he is like an actual creative. Especially within the context of the people who are working at, on games at this level, and were at the forefront of games back when games still had like a forefront, definably speaking. So yeah, he's very capable of painting an image of himself, with the help of the sycophantic host and his business buddy, Bing. Which is just a lovely alliteration. But yeah, again, you just kind of have to read between the lines with some of this. But yeah, I mean, I can see why he's a successful negotiator. I can see why he's capable of he's a very effective salesperson. I'll say that.
Yeah. Yep. No, I definitely agree. Well. So I don't want to, like I said, I don't want to belabor too many of the macro points because I know there were two specifically kind of more in-depth things that we wanted to talk about, and you alluded to having something that was more high level about the podcast. So, what are you thinking? What's in the brain?
So I have two quick podcast notes, which. Don't get me wrong, I'm not the god emperor of podcasts. I have as much I have more to learn than I have to teach, but two quick things. One, is it necessary that that at least one person in the room be eating celery during the recording? Because they were eating celery.
I don't think I noticed who was eating celery.
I don't know. I wasn't looking at the screen during the celery portion, but I glanced and I can't remember who it was, but someone was holding celery. But I remember they're having a conversation about like stock prices or some shit, and I'm just hearing. And I look over and someone's just holding a stick of celery.
Missed that.
Yeah, like, hey Bob.
Wow.
Hey Bob. They make a joke later about having dinner plans afterwards or something, and I'm like, could you wait? Could you not eat celery in the middle of the recording? It was so strange that there would even be celery within reach during this interview. And I'm like, a bottle of water? Yes. A stick of the crunchiest veggie you ever done heard? Wild. And I don't know, maybe I accidentally Mandela affected myself, or I just like hallucinated the celery, but I distinctly remember them eating celery at a certain point. And I'm like, that's a buck wild energy to bring to a podcast. Anyway, that aside, the other thing that I just wanted to mention, and this was not lost on the commenters underneath the podcast on YouTube, but there came a moment when the kid did not know who Miyamoto was. They were sharing anecdotes about I think like the first time he saw the Wii in action, and or they were talking about, I can't remember what it was. It was some crossover with Nintendo, and Bing goes, "Oh yeah, Miyamoto's always blah blah blah," and the kid's like, "Oh, what, Miyamoto? Who's that? Who's that?" Like he had absolutely no idea who Miyamoto was, and I'm like,
you know who the kid reminds me of? I just fucking realized
who,
it. And it's not a flattering comparison. You know, in it's not the first Mad Max, but like the first renewed
he
one.
Looks like
how
Nux.
There's the yeah,
Nicholas
he looks
Hoult.
like, well, I mean, they're both bald, so that's an easy comparison. And as a follically challenged man, I have no issues with the bald. But it's like the same eagerness, you know, with those characters.
Yeah.
Like a little overly eager,
nervous
a little
energy.
weird.
Yeah. There's a bit of Nicholas Hoult performance in there. Yeah, but I don't know. I'm not crazy. I'm not saying that we need to have some reverence for the biggest people in the games industry and the most influential. It's not like we need to like deify these people, or you can't even be, you're not real if you don't know blah blah blah, because some people don't remember names. But like, how are you prepared to have a conversation that's going to span basically the entirety of the modern games industry and not have a basic like, how would you not know who Miyamoto was if you've done any level of research into the history of video games? Like, does somebody need to describe to you the person who created like Mario and Zelda and drove Nintendo, creatively speaking, through, you know, the dawn of modern games all the way up to now? That's just kind of a buck wild omission to me that sort of invalidates the kid as, I mean, it kind of explains why his observations and inputs were very surface level. I don't think he has any understanding of the games industry. I think he's just like a trust fund kid who works at a venture capital firm. You know, so his knowledge of the games industry itself might be fairly limited, but yeah, that was just kind of a wild omission. Anyway, nitpicks aside, there were a couple of I'll say heavy hitters in terms of comments and just kind of narrative through lines that came out of this particular interview podcast situation. The most notable of which, if you pay attention to or read any sort of like games journalism that's going on out there in the wild world, you've probably heard some of these comments by the time this episode comes out. But yeah, Robert decided that it was time to, let's say, readdress the allegations of workplace toxicity and harassment and a bunch of the other stuff that came out in and around the same time as the petition to remove him as CEO, all that fun stuff. He decided to reopen that particular tome in what I will call not perhaps the most enlightened way. I'll let you take that from there.
Well, I will say in Bobby's defense, he was not the one that brought it up randomly. He was asked a question about it. Now, what I will say against Bobby is I feel like a lot of the time, especially if you're like a controversial figure like Bobby Kotick, you probably have an idea of what questions are going to get asked to you. I feel like he probably knew this was going to be asked in some form. So, yeah, I mean, it's not much better than him just kind of randomly bringing it up.
I also just, yeah. Anyway, so the gist of it is, when the topic of these allegations came back up, he just very offhanded is like, oh, it's all fake. Oh, it's all fake. And
well, Aaron, tell us what actually happened. You know, I've never heard of any of these claims, and Bobby seems like a cool guy based on this video. You know, what really happened?
What really happened? The truth behind,
we're using sarcasm to clarify. Just
the truth behind these widespread allegations is that the United, what was it, workers?
Communication
Workers of America, the union, was such a bad union, and they represented so many dying industries that they noticed their membership numbers were dwindling. So the very smart, now fired heads of that union, important to make both of those notes because he did, came up with a crafty plan to leverage government agencies to create fake lawsuits filled with false allegations against him and Activision-Blizzard to attack their workplace culture, to drive up union enrollments. That's what that really was. And also, according to Bobby, the union was later forced to admit they were lying and retract all the allegations. The first part of that is wild, because that's a pretty severe accusation. And the second part is wild because it is demonstrably untrue.
Yeah. Well, it's also interesting because he brings in Riot Games. He specifically says that Blizzard and Riot Games were targeted by the communication workers. It's wild to me to bring in Riot Games because Riot Games has basically said, yes, all that stuff was happening and we're very sorry and we're going to make a workplace that isn't toxic. Like, Riot's the infamous one of like male employees like farting on female employees for fun, I guess. I don't know.
That sounds
weird, but
delightfully juvenile.
Yeah. So it's weird to bring in Riot Games because I don't know that strengthens his argument very much when there's a lot of evidence of Riot saying all this did happen and we're very sorry.
Yeah.
Eventually. So, curious situation for sure.
Yeah. And these comments, I think, I don't know. I could be kind of wrong. It's possible that Bobby is just enough of a polarizing figure to draw in attention regardless. But I think that this episode, which is currently just shy of 8,000 views on YouTube, which isn't exactly, tearing the internet apart or anything, but it has drawn a lot of comments from people predominantly because of those offhanded remarks that he made. And I'll get to that in one sec, but it's fascinating if you listen to the interview, just how offhanded his initial dismissal of all of this stuff is. And then he launches into this wild conspiracy followed by just blatant untruths with the confidence of somebody stating absolute empirical fact, right? Almost a tiredness to his voice during this, like, oh, you see it all the time. It's one of those things where the union creates an incredible conspiracy and lies and fabricates evidence in order to drive up membership. Sometimes it happens.
And Bing supports that idea. Like, while Bobby's going on this whole thing, Bing starts being like, oh, I knew a company where that happened and da-dee-da-dee-da-da-da. And I'm like, my fucking God. Like, it's fucking wild. I think the funniest lie, Aaron, that Bobby says is he's like, the union, they came after us because we had great pay, we gave great benefits, et cetera, et cetera. That
Blizzard
is the easiest
notoriously not
disprovable
known for
thing.
that.
Well, yeah, and I know a ton of people that work at Activision-Blizzard. I actually almost thought about reaching out to a bunch of them and seeing what statements I could get on that specific comment, because I frequently hear that Blizzard does not pay well enough. And literally in Play Nice, there are sections where it talks about the benefits getting worse and worse and worse at Blizzard.
Right.
Now, I'm not blaming Bobby for that necessarily, because the implication is that it was probably also Blizzard leadership, but Bobby just lies.
Yeah.
He's just like, we've got the best benefits, we have the best pay, and it's like known industry wide that is bullshit.
Yeah. But, that one
you know,
very much stuck out to me as well, where he was like, oh, our culture is immaculate and the pay is great and the benefits are great, and I'm like, that is not the understanding that anyone the understanding is usually that, like, you work at Blizzard because it's your dream to work at Blizzard, not because you're going to get a big fat paycheck out of it. They kind of college farm in a sense, where, you know, they're a company that will take people on for well under their worth for the prestige of working for Blizzard.
The point that you just made is literally mentioned in Play Nice.
Yeah.
There are excerpts where they're talking about different people that have worked at Blizzard during different times. And I can't remember who the executive is, but in one of the chapters, one of the executives tells someone basically, like, you work at Blizzard for the prestige of working at Blizzard. You don't work here to make the most money. Like, part of the pay is working in this, like, game-changing environment.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is wild. I think the other thing that makes a lot of this interesting when you look at Jason Schreier's book, Play Nice, is that Bobby makes the claim that, like, there had never been any weird, like, sexual harassment or gender discrimination weirdness happening at Blizzard, or Activision Blizzard. We can't really talk much to Activision because most of Play Nice focuses on Blizzard, but I mean, you finished Play Nice, so I'm sure you even have more examples than me. I can't remember the exact example in Play Nice, but there's an example, Aaron, where, well, the book makes it very clear that there was a lot of weird dating going on at Blizzard, where, like, low-level female employees would be dating, like, executives.
Yep.
And there was all this kind of, like, incestuous. When I say incestuous, I just mean people at the same company, not literal incest. Incestuous dating going on. And there was one guy who, I think he was maybe like a senior programmer or something like that, but he ended up, like, divorcing his wife. And then one of the executives at Blizzard, he and his wife fell upon hard times, so they got a divorce. And then this executive's wife starts dating the senior developer.
Yeah.
And then the senior developer gets, like, shit canned because of, you know, feelings that the executive had towards his ex-wife and this new guy dating. Like, that is a very clear situation where, I mean, is it sexual harassment? Maybe, but it opens up so much uncomfortable things when it comes to gender discrimination and sexual harassment. And there's excerpts of women saying, yeah, I loved Blizzard, but it was a boys' club. Like, there is a ton of detailed evidence that really just kind of poo-poos on Bobby's comments.
The only way, yeah, and I mean, like, we'll definitely, like, I'll take the weird, like, dating pool thing out of it, because at the very least, all of that is, like, consensual attention for the most part. I'm sure that there are exceptions to that rule. But, like, yeah, there are almost countless accounts of especially female employees describing uncomfortable experiences that don't exactly jive with Bobby's claims of an immaculate culture, that, you know, was spoiled by union recruiting efforts. So the only way that you can really trust fully that Bobby is right is to be a C-suite executive just kind of holed up in your little PR world, where you can just say that and you don't have to back it up because the sycophantic kid host of the podcast isn't going to call you out on it. It was like watching that Joe Rogan Zuckerberg interview all over again. Like, I'm not going to challenge anything you say. What you say has to be true. I'm a big dumb animal.
Yeah, well, also here's the thing. We've both been working professionally now for, dear Lord, 7 years, pretty much. I was looking at one of the old lawsuit filings that was communicated by GameIndustry.biz, and one of the comments is that there were things called cube crawls that were happening. Yeah. The exact quote is, male employees proudly came into work hungover, played video games for long periods of time during work while delegating their responsibilities to female employees, engaged in banter about their sexual encounters, talk openly about female bodies, and joke about rape. The reason I wanted to bring up this specific comment is because as someone that has worked professionally with other men, I will admit I have not seen many cases of men coming in hungover. I haven't seen many cases of men coming in and necessarily like delegating tasks to females or playing video games for like long periods of time during work. But I have absolutely been at jobs where men and other people just talk about sexual encounters and sexual things in front of me without necessarily knowing me very well enough to have that kind of a conversation. I have consistently had male coworkers that will bring up female bodies in front of me, openly in within earshot of other women. And just in general, the games industry has historically not had a very good relationship with rape and not joking about it. Classic examples of like prison rape being air quotes funny is a thing that comes up. So like, these are all things that I can, these are believable things. These are not like, oh, well, men are just murdering women in the office. Like ridiculous, like over the top things. I experience these things. I wouldn't say daily. I think the place I work now has a pretty solid culture, but like I have experienced these things in my career. These are not things that are hard for me to believe in terms of them happening anywhere.
No, I mean, those just do happen.
And that's not a good thing, obviously.
No,
but like
it's not to say like I'll bet you if you put like undercover teen boss into a McDonald's, you'd hear these conversations going on every single where. It's not good. It's not professional, and it's not something that I'm trying to like laud, but it's widespread. It's not outlandish to assume that this level of I'm going to abandon that sentence. I'm going to jettison that bad boy right out the vacuum. These are not claims that you necessarily need to be like, well, it's fake news because it couldn't be. Not here. Those are commonplace. Those are, predictable sort of issues. And, just kind of wildly blanket denying all of that stuff almost makes everything else seem more suspicious by association.
Yeah, it's just wild to cast doubt that kind of stuff is happening. Like if I was a business owner, especially if a company as big as Activision-Blizzard, or a CEO, I guess, I would absolutely think that stuff is happening at some level because it's just so like it. I feel like no matter what you do, there are going to be people that somehow get into your organization and they do that kind of shit just because it is such a kind of like pervasive issue, mostly with men. Like I'm not saying that necessarily that should mean like your whole company is soured, but you got to do something about it. If people act inappropriately, you should take action to try and correct it and da-da-da-da-da.
Yeah.
But yeah, the main point here that Aaron and I are bringing up is like, he has this weird conspiracy theory. He makes blatant lies, and there is a ton of evidence that strongly suggests, if not straight up proves, that all of this was happening. And, just to take a quick quote from, I think this is the communication workers, one of their people. It says, Bobby Kotick's comments on a podcast uplifting billionaires are both insulting to the Activision workers who spoke out about the harassment they faced, and unsurprising. And I largely agree.
Yeah, I think that's well
with
put.
That. I will say it is mildly surprising because apparently in a 2021 press release, Bobby Kotick actually apologized for the inappropriate conduct that was happening under his watch. So it's a little bit weird for him to make a press release and then backtrack on it. Kind of a strange comment. He also never brings up the press release that he said. He's not like, oh, I was coerced into it. Like, it's weird.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think people might not remember the press release unless they're doing a podcast about his podcast appearance. The general populace is probably just going to be like, oh, there's Bobby's talking about his business things, blah, blah, blah. The uncritical viewer isn't going to necessarily realize that, and they'll probably just write it off as like, oh, that's just PR he had to do to help with the this and the that. Yeah, people will bend over backwards to manipulate the narrative to suit whatever dumb shit their billionaires say.
Yeah. Nope. Definitely true. So I don't think I have anything else on that specific story. Do you think we're good to kind of move into the last quick thing that we mentioned?
Yep.
Cool.
I'm already there.
Cool. I'm behind. I'm trying to catch up. Okay. So again, really recommend that you watch this after, I'm choking, that you watch this after, listening to, I guess you could listen to Play Nice. There probably are audiobooks. Actually, I know that there are audiobooks. But read Play Nice, listen to Play Nice, then watch this interview. It is super interesting if you do it that way. One of the things that comes up is, of course, Blizzard and a lot of the leadership at Blizzard. And I think through omission or through the way that Bobby talks about certain leaders, you can infer some interesting things. The first one is that a few different people are mentioned. Mainly it's Mike Morhaime, Chris Metzen, and Alan Adams.
Singular Adam.
Oh, Alan Adam?
Yeah.
Oh, I thought it was Adams. Anyway, sorry.
No, you're good.
Okay. So he brings up a lot of these people, and he specifically glazes up Alan Adam and Chris Metzen. Chris Metzen, to me, isn't that surprising. Like, Chris Metzen is like a super public facing figure at Blizzard that a ton of people love. He's got kind of this like interesting story about him and his now ex-wife. I think he has kids. It's not like in a bad story, but it like his story with him and his ex-wife kind of like got into the literature of some of the characters that people care about and WoW. And so he's a very likable person. Like, a lot of people like the energy that Chris Metzen brings. And for the most part, he's not seen as one of the like uber problematic people from Blizzard. Alan Adams is one of the original founders of Blizzard. And then Mike Morhaime, I just realized that I put Mike Horheim.
You did. I left it there for you.
Yeah, I don't know. Dyslexia. He's not a whore. That was just a typo.
Horheim is the ancient Norse dimension of horrors.
Yeah, the ancient whore dimension. But Mike Morhaime,
God of War 3.
Mike Morhaime is one of the other founders, right? He's the other founder.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, so that's who all these people are. And he kind of talks down Mike Morhaime. Like, he says that Alan was like this visionary, this like super creative guy. He was who we had to bring back. He talks about Chris Metzen being great and all these other things, but he kind of poo-poos on Mike Morhaime. Yeah. Which I think is interesting.
Almost entirely by omission and dismissal, right? Where someone would be like, oh, and then the creative brilliance, and then they mention the founders, and he goes, it wasn't Mike. It wasn't Mike. It was Chris,
Yeah.
Or it wasn't Mike. Adam was the real, every time the guy's name comes up in the conversation, Bobby like bats it to the other side of the court and is like, not him. Which does make you wonder what their dynamic is like a little bit.
Yeah. It's interesting. I'll be curious when I finish Play Nice if anything else gets illuminated. I mean, you finished it, so is there anything that I don't really care about spoilers on my end? Is there anything in Play Nice that kind of alludes to what might be going on there? Or are you kind of equally unaware, having finished Play Nice, of what this weird dynamic could be coming, like where that could be coming from?
Granted, it has been a minute since I finished the book. So I don't have the freshest eyes on that particular dynamic, but I don't recall there being any specific like instances of stuff happening that would kind of fuel that dynamic. I do think that he was out of the company for the longest though, right? Like he was in that original wave of creative stuff, and then I think he, took steps back from the company pretty early on.
No, so that was Adam.
Oh, I've gotten my visionary co-founders mixed up.
That's why Bobby brought him back. The one thing I also think's interesting that I'm just remembering, because I have a note right here, is that Bobby says that a lot of the founders, he specifically calls out Mike Morhaime here, had seller's remorse.
Yeah.
In the sense that, like, which I kind of get, they kept getting sold over and over and over again and never really got to own their own success. And Bobby brings up a lot like they were, don't get me wrong, they were making money, but they weren't making as much money as like Bobby was or some of these other executives who were benefiting a crazy amount off of Blizzard's success. I think that is so interesting. And the reason I think that's so interesting, Aaron, is because in Play Nice, we get the next level. So it goes like the executives that Bobby's kind of talking to who are making like billions and millions of dollars, or maybe not billions, but millions of dollars off of Blizzard, right?
Yeah.
And then there's like the founders who are making like thousands and probably millions of dollars off of Blizzard and being the founder. And then there are the employees who are maybe making thousands of dollars whenever Blizzard does well. So I think it's so funny that like all the founders were, well, at least Mike Morhaime apparently was having seller's remorse and all these issues with not making enough money. And then they were like, in the book, it makes it sound like they were kind of, poo-pooing some of the employees that were like, why are we not getting more of the cut when our games are like selling so crazy?
Yeah.
I thought that was wild to hear, people complain about how much money they're making as founders when apparently a lot of just the normal developers were not seeing as much money as they were kind of promised.
Yeah. I think the book does a decent job of kind of bringing that tension into it. There's a lot of different talks about like, the profit sharing structure, that kind of went through several different permutations over the studio's tenure, but it also they definitely talked about the fact that some of the founders definitely made like boat money, and some of them did not necessarily. I don't know. It's definitely interesting to look at like the different tiers of compensation there.
Yeah, it's just, I feel like this interview provides so much additional context, regardless of whether it's true or not, that is so interesting when you're looking at the history of Blizzard. So it is funny. I guess like my closing salvo with all of this interview is really funny to me because I feel like it really sheds a different perspective, a different light on this period of the game industry in a way. I don't know. Honest to God, I think that even if it is a biased attempt at glazing up Bobby Kotick, I think it is super valuable in that it it just I don't know, I think it just provides an extra layer of context to things. Like, even within lies, even within exaggerations, even within, all of that, you can still get nuggets of truth and nuggets of context that help paint the full picture. And I think, like I said, this is ultimately just a really good companion interview to Play Nice. Obviously it's biased. Obviously it's kind of gross because it really does kind of illustrate this like oligarchy that we have, this like perversion of wealth.
Yeah.
But it I don't know. I struggled to not think some of it was super cool to listen on,
yeah,
and get some context on.
All joking aside, yeah. I think if you haven't read Play Nice, you should read Play Nice. If you enjoy this show, if you've managed to stick it out with us on this show, or if you found us and enjoy us, go read Play Nice. It is the better version of this. It's Jason Schreier's reporting is one of the reasons that I got interested in doing not just a show, but like writing in the games world to begin with. And the book is just, as with his two other books, very much worth reading. Within this context, read Play Nice and then listen to this episode, because they really are, as we've said a couple of times, great companion pieces for one another. It is like hearing the same story from two different perspectives. One of them willing to lend a critical eye, and the other one more interested in preserving appearances. But again, if you go into it with your eyes open and an awareness of the context, it's absolutely fascinating. And even if, to be honest with you, even if you don't do that, there are just some good nuggets in there in terms of game history. There's a lot of really cool little bits and pieces of information in the podcast that are interesting in their own right. But in terms of making it through the whole 2 hours, it's best to do it with Play Nice kind of ringing in your memory, because it does help you sift through the wreckage of the ship once known as Truth. But yeah, it's fascinating. Lies aside, exaggerations aside, doesn't look like Bobby's done with us just yet, I guess.
And I haven't been happier.
Yeah, but with that said, unless you had anything else, I'm ready to thank Beach Girl.
I'm good. I'm good to close out.
Cool. Well then, thank you, Beach Girl. Thank you for providing our wonderful intro and outro music, and thank you also for populating the internet with your great tunes, which I can and do often listen to on Spotify, SoundCloud, Bandcamp, and YouTube and other popular streaming platforms. So thank you, Beach Girl. And I hope that you gain some new listeners organically, not directly as a result of me saying things to you on a recorded medium.
I would like to thank E. Dougie. I'm you sounded so uncomfortable going out of that. I just needed to make it worse for you. I'm sorry.
No, it was pretty bad.
I'd like to thank E. Dougie Art. E. Dougie Art is the wonderful artist who, of course, made our podcast logo, album art, whatever I decide to call it on a specific day. E. Dougie Art also goes by Mosscat Market, which makes my life difficult. It's E. Dougie Art on Etsy. That's at E. Dougie Art on Etsy. And on Instagram, it should be at Mosscat Market. There is the potential that she has changed the Etsy page to fit Mosscat Market. So anyway, we love them both. Thank you, E. Dougie Art. And thank you, Beach Girl, for your support. Thank you for tuning in today. We appreciate you.
Of course.
And goodbye.
Goodbye.
That, by the way, was the first feature of using the Rumble pack in Zelda.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
Can you guys acknowledge that the N64 is the best console? Can we agree on that, or can we not?